Startups begin in communities across the country.
Why does Silicon Valley get so much credit? My name is Nick Kastner.
And I'm Caitlin Clays. We're interviewing the people building startup communities across America.
But in the areas no one is talking about, the middle.
This is the Ecosystem Builder Podcast by MugNews.
This is Nick Kastner, and I am interviewing Erica Wassinger. Erica is an ecosystem builder from Omaha, Nebraska, and compared to all of the other interviews that have dropped in the feed, I love interviewing my hometown ecosystem builders. So Erica and I are both in Omaha, but conducting the interview remote. So Erica, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, great. Hey, thanks for having me. Who are some of the other players that you guys have talked to so far? What are some of the other markets that we should watch for?
Yes. So I have chatted with Christina Oldfather, who's just down the road in Lincoln, Scott Resnicek, Cecilia Wassinger out of Oklahoma, Tulsa, I think is where she's from.
Yeah.
Yes. Cecilia was a delight to talk to. And as I'm sure you know, she's specialized in the diversity and inclusion. And she advises she advises communities across the country on how to create a more inclusive environment. And especially, I talked to her a few weeks after all the Black Lives Matter protests this summer, and it was just a very timely conversation that I got a lot out of. And that's
an important conversation to have, especially around entrepreneurial ecosystems. That
exactly.
There's a need for that.
Absolutely. And the cliche is that, it's all white dudes that show up to every single one of your events. So really having her break that down and how to fix the problem as opposed to kind of the slogan that makes everyone feel good, but doesn't actually move the needle. It was a good conversation. But Erica, I'm I was combing through my questions beforehand, and I am eager to ask you some things that I wouldn't necessarily know as I kind of see you as the leader of the local community.
Oh, golly, no.
Yeah. First being, how did you first get involved in entrepreneurial startup activity?
That's a fun narrative. So I moved back to Nebraska from being in Dallas, Texas. And I got back here. I was doing, at that point, and this will make you laugh, Nick, I was doing traditional public relations, and Twitter had just opened Twitter for Business. So, I was 22, 23, and because of my age, I was slung into social media. When I got back, it was a little different marketing scene and advertising scene here. It was not quite the pace I was used to. So luckily I got connected with Mark Haysbrook, who I actually am incredibly grateful for in terms of his influence on my career. He had me work on a lot of the startups that he was funding and launching either through Straight Shot or Fund 2 at Dundee Venture Capital. And Mark would do this thing. He would walk around a room with a baseball bat, for anybody who knows Mark. He would swing the baseball bat. This is how Mark thinks, and he paces. And he would give me the debrief on the company. And then he would say, the board meeting is on this date, usually 3 months later. Go ahead and grow it. And we would assume that would be through PR or marketing or sometimes some other sales related or content related initiatives. And Nick, it worked sometimes. And sometimes it was no amount of great sales and PR will solve some of the challenges these companies were up against, which were rooted in product market fit. So Mark and I kept on our journey together. We launched an incubator here in town called Omaha Startup Collaborative. We were nomadic. We were super lucky. Creighton let us squat on one of their buildings for way longer than we should have. Without a lease. We're very grateful for Dean Hendrickson over there for making that happen. We went over to the AIM building. We did a lot of fun renovations over there, worked closely with the AIM team, stayed there for a while. Ultimately, Mark and I made the decision to merge one of his assets, Straight Shot, which is a traditional accelerator, that incubator that we had created with something that Nathan Preheim, who was one of Mark's former portfolio company founders, he had joined the Greater Omaha Chamber. So we merged all three of these assets together. And that was the launch of the Startup Collaborative. And that was almost 4 years ago, which is nutty. And the pursuit of that, Nick, was literally all about getting product market fit as early as humanly possible. So whomever the next iteration of Erica was, sitting in the room with Mark as he's swinging the baseball bat, pacing, poised to grow the company, could grow the company super fast right out the gate because there would be faster product market fit there.
Yes, yeah, I have actually interviewed Mark in his office, and I think there was a baseball bat leaning up against.
There's always, and he does. I mean, he's wonderful. Mark's wonderful. He was one of the greatest influences on me.
So the Startup Collaborative is now underneath the Omaha Chamber, correct?
It is a part of the chamber. Yep. And so I am you're catching me in an interesting evolution again in my career. So we've been working on the Startup Collaborative for 4 years now. We've worked with hundreds of founders, which has been incredible. We looked across this ecosystem and said, we need a lot more people to start up, and we need to make it less risky for them to do so. So that program has a huge funnel. If you think about like the starting point, we really broke it down very simply. What is the first thing you have to worry about? Does anybody have a problem that needs solved? And then do there 20 people that need to solve that problem? And then we grow companies from that point on. So some of I think the companies we're most proud of that we've gotten a chance to ride shotgun to, Retail Aware. We've worked closely with the Breeze team, Pinata, JobShare Connect, Juno, Switchboom, so many others that have come out, Audit Miner.
Amazing. What's one thing about Omaha's community that someone who doesn't live in Omaha may not know?
That's an interesting question, Nick. So while TSC is technically a program of the Omaha Chamber, we've always been really lucky because the Omaha Chamber has taken such a broad stance on generally what's good for Nebraska is good for Omaha.
And
so,
TSC is Tech Startup Collaborative, right?
Yep, the Startup Collaborative. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So what I think is unique to Nebraska in general, and I would say this rings true in Omaha, is just Nebraskans are generally accessible. And so if you can understand and at least name the networks, usually the networks open themselves to you. And I've never quite lived in a market like this. I spent a lot of time in Dallas. Like I said, I spent a lot of time in New York, and never before can you email a Fortune 500 CEO and like within a week you're up in their office and you're talking about your, baby startup that doesn't have a single customer yet. And have that CEO be really invested in what you're doing and hopefully helpful too. So I think that's very true for Nebraska. I've had that same exact experience in the Sand Hills. Networks are, if you can name them, you can penetrate them. I think we need to be better as a state at being able to name and sort of open source those networks of power.
Yes, yeah, I like the mantra that if you can name it, you can have access to it.
Yes, if you know it exists, you can get it. And I would say that's a unique factor here.
Yes, absolutely. So what is there like a hub, or what do you think of as the hub of resources that, like, if I were starting a business in Omaha, where would I go to learn about like grants and interest-free loans and events and like all of the resources Omaha has for entrepreneurs?
Well, I'm the co-founder of the Startup Collaborative, so I'm super biased, Nick. I know you're giving me a softball here, but I would say as you're start with the Startup Collaborative. And I think you start to build and answer some of these questions you have about starting a business at the moment when you need them answered. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs tend to rush to like, oh, I need to legally incorporate. I need to do this. I need to get a logo. I need to spend money on code. And there's a lot of steps that you can do before you spend any money or even too much time to make sure you spend the right money and the right time on something that will have product market fit, that will be scalable, that will grow.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And then kind of under the same vein, I moved to Omaha in the pandemic. So
I remember this. This was not long ago. This was like, hi, we're going to meet in person. And I think you and I were like, maybe this fall.
Exactly. When a lot of the like components and major players of Omaha's startup community I have yet to meet because everyone's remote and like virtual events just really aren't the same. When things go back to normal, what would you call the startup hangouts in Omaha?
I think it's going to be different post-pandemic, right?
Yeah.
Because think about what came online during the pandemic. Millwork Commons came online, and that is stunning and gorgeous. Last week, Unimed and the university announced what they're doing on Saddle Creek with an entire innovation hub. You've got pockets of density around Omaha. Omaha is Omaha is interesting in the sense that our entrepreneurs, at least those we have seen through the Startup Collaborative, tend to, I would say, buck traditional stereotypes. So in the Startup Collaborative, our average entrepreneur is in their late 30s, early 40s. They tend to have a couple of kids. They are director level or higher in their current day job or career, and they're looking at taking a big swing, typically in the industry that they've worked in for 10 or so years. And so Omaha, I would say founders and actual company creators, not necessarily all of the folks that attend all the ecosystem events, but the company creators tend to be just a little older with a lot more things going on. And they are heads down. I think of sort of Omaha founders that are really iconically heads down. I think the Builder Trend team is very iconically heads down. I think Life Loop is iconically heads down. I think Leandro and Carissa Castro are iconically heads down. Mylan is heads down. Omaha is, I don't know, maybe pragmatic to a fault, where we are not as communal as we need to be. Hopefully, when we are all vaccinated and safe and able to congregate again, we'll just be so excited that events and locations become a bigger draw for all of the actual founders, not just sort of the ecosystem at large to participate in.
Yes, yeah. How do you think you go? So a lot of those founders you name, like Carissa Castro, I've worked with, Abulu, and she is just whatever she's doing,
focused,
hyper focused, and she the product she puts out is always amazing.
Hyper focused. You can tell they're product obsessed, they're customer obsessed. There is a very strong thread across Nebraska entrepreneurs where they are very much focused on building a sustainable business, and then focused on the excitement around that business.
Yes, yeah. How do you bring them into that excitement of both? Because there's value in people talking about what they're doing.
Yes,
there is.
Yeah. That was one of my challenges just convincing humans to talk about it. So that sort of brings me to an interesting moment, truthfully. If you think about founders beget founders, what we learned through the Startup Collaborative, and the Startup Collaborative, if you really think that is the moment of an idea up to the first 100 customers. So that's that org's role in an ecosystem. When we started really seeing our numbers raise, and when we started seeing a lot more very Carissa Castro-like founders come into the ecosystem, or Jessica Charlson, or that persona come in, it came when we started giving really small snippets of content about founders like them that were juggling all the things and figuring out how to build a business on the weekends, in their nights and evenings. And we're starting to gain some success in doing that. But it wasn't necessarily the stories of $1 million funding round, or even hiring 100 people, or those type of things that would beget founders. It was way earlier, Nick. It was like, so-and-so got this 25th customer. And it was a big deal because 25 unlocks this level of MRR, which means the founders are going full-time on the business. We were that early in our marketing messaging where we could almost show should-be entrepreneurs themselves just a couple steps ahead. So it wasn't this overwhelming, eat the entire elephant in one sitting moment. It was one bite at a time. That has helped a ton with the Startup Collaborative. That same sense of small bites or milestones along the way really informed the venture fund that we're closing, or have first close on coming up here. The sense of there are milestones that prove that you are gaining success and tractions. And they're not necessarily the same that you would see in a bank loan. They're not necessarily the same that you would see at a Series A funding event, but there are milestones that are rooted in something that I think Nebraska founders find comfort in. So if I think of a Amy Johnson or a Jen Amos, or if I think of even a Corey Scott in Lincoln, those founders are actually most excited and confident when they get more customers. They are like, oh yeah, I'm going to tell my story after I get that next set of customers, or after I get this next revenue milestone. They're very much I want to keep building a great business, and then I'll tell the story of the great business. But until I get that business, I don't need to be chatting about it too much.
Yes, yeah. What are some of those milestones that you teach founders of like, hey, this is a big deal, even though the bank may not appreciate it?
I would say anything related to customer, truthfully. And I think that's what gives founders the most control is that proximity and that closeness to what their customer needs and wants, and not forgetting that customers will build a company. Capital doesn't build a company. Revenue from customers build a company. Code doesn't build a company. Customers that use code build a company. And so in the startup collaborative, we look at milestones like, did you talk to 20 people about a problem that you had? Did you show your wireframes to a set of customers that could be buyers? Did they commit to buying? Did you start to see 10 customers come on board in your first couple of months? Did you start to see more than that? Like we really pin it back to success as defined by the market or customers, which ultimately is the strongest foundation that an entrepreneur can build a company on. But I think what's interesting about that too, Nick, when we kind of come back to this larger lens of equitable entrepreneurship, as I'm a woman, as a woman, there's not a lot of venture dollars flowing to women. In fact, this year we've backslid in terms of the dollars going into women. So it's naive to think that you can count on the venture capital industry as a female founder to fund your company, right? There's just odds stacked against you. So how do you change that narrative? Well, you get customers, you build revenue through something you can control. I think while this isn't my walked experience, but I've learned this from several of my peers and my colleagues. The same is true for a person of color, right? Your odds of getting venture capital are lower.
Much lower.
Empirically lower.
Yes.
So what can you do to build a great company that generates sustainability and cash for you and also generational wealth? Get customers to fund it. So that has really been, I think, the hallmark of the Startup Collaborative. And then as I sort of evolve to manage Proven Ventures, the fund, that's absolutely a hallmark of our fund's look is can this company stand on its own with or without our capital and with or without us? Like, is this a great business, right? And does our capital improve their odds of being a great business? And does our capacity as general partners on the fund help those entrepreneurs grow?
Yes, yeah. With this fund that you mentioned, are you like specifically looking to isolate like females or people of color to distribute some of that money to?
I would say like level the playing field. So
Yeah.
what we saw with the Startup Collaborative, I think it blows everyone's mind. We saw hundreds of founders. So that one is mind blowing in general in the venture community. So hundreds of people are saying, I have an idea to start up and I'm going to see if customers want that idea. Of those hundreds of people that we saw, half of them were women. So that tells me there is zero pipeline problem, and 40% would identify as a person of color. Okay, so we don't have a pipeline problem here. That is actually not the situation. We have a challenge getting capital to the pipeline early enough to ensure that that pipeline has a better shot at success. And I would say the same is true for customers and otherwise. So with the Proven Ventures Fund, we don't necessarily have isolated targets. We expect parity of our demographics. So I expect that we have half of our portfolio going into female-led companies. I expect that we have 40% of our capital going into founders of color, because that is what's in our backyard. And we know firsthand that they are generating incredible companies. And candidly, we'll be excited to fund them because they're going to be great companies. And our model of funding is flexible enough to allow for multiple sort of end dates, if you may, on a traditional venture formula.
Yes, yeah, it's very exciting to hear you talk about the pipeline and the fact that, because like in a lot of context, people, the pipeline problem is the one that they just kind of like
such a lazy blame. It's such a lazy
yes.
blame.
Yes, very much.
And I think that comes back to naming the networks, right? So if we know inherently as Nebraskans, we have this incredible sort of doors always open mentality, let's make sure people know where the door is. Let's make sure that people feel like they can walk through the door and bring themselves to the door comfortably. And then let's also acknowledge that sometimes our I don't know, to carry on this house analogy even further, like, let's make sure the table's set well, that it makes people feel that they can be their whole selves.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so I have some quick hitting questions that we're asking every ecosystem builder wherever we go, so we can kind of pool together. They're like, oh, if you want to learn about Topeka, click on the Topeka episode. And some of them we've already touched on. So most successful startup from Omaha. You mentioned Buildertrend, LifeLoop. Who else would you add to the list?
I think, can you define age, stage, and what success counts as? I mean, Buildertrend just is celebrating a hell of a investment from Bain Capital, but I think with or without that investment, Buildertrend is an incredible company that has created an incredible number of jobs. And of course, me, customer obsessed, loves their approach to creating a company because they've done it through sales.
Yes, yeah. I'll define it for this of job number, especially like ecosystem building from like an academic sense is all about economic growth. And Buildertrend again is a very, very good example. 2 of my roommates work at Buildertrend, as a matter of fact. So
good. They you should keep them close. Probably keep them close. I love Buildertrend as an example. When I look down funnel, if you may, or like younger companies, I think what Encounter Telehealth is doing with Jen Amos is wildly important in terms of solving big issues and creating really interesting jobs. So Encounter Telehealth connects telepsychiatry with rural health networks. So specifically in long-term care facilities, which obviously in the pandemic needs that support more than ever. I think Flywheel is an obvious celebration and an obvious success, and at such a speed and rapid nature that it's hard not to look at Flywheel and say they did great. I think Multi-Mechanics was a huge success in terms of the caliber of talent they brought in. I mean, Leandro and Chris have somehow pulled rabbits out of the hat and convinced Harvard and MIT and all these incredible institutions to send their devs here to build Multi-Mechanics. So there's a lot of wins. I think Retail Aware is a growing concern in terms of job creation and exciting companies. I think Breeze has had a really incredible track record in terms of recruiting companies. So I don't know. There's a lot. We've had a lot of good companies. We have a lot of good companies.
Yes. How about entrepreneurs? So like Keith Fix with Retail Aware. We mentioned.
I know. I have Keith Fix. I have his like shirt on right now. I am really, really excited about Keith Fix. I think great entrepreneurs, Amy Johnson, Jen Amos, obviously those are sort of at that Series A kind of level. I would say Keith Fix, Colin Nabity. Colin Nabity is so heads down. He'll never tell you how great he is, but he is exceptional as an entrepreneur. I think up and comers looking at Jessica Charleston and Gina Picarella are really, really interesting. Leandro Castro is a really exceptional entrepreneur, but I think we're all going to be a little shocked when we see how exceptional Carissa is as the CEO. And you and I have talked a little bit about her. I think what Ryan Witt, he's formerly of D3 Banking, what he's building with Veramed now is really interesting. There's no shortage of really great founders. Like there's so many good founders in our backyard. And I could literally, Karina Glover. I mean, can we just talk for 2 seconds about Karina as like, everyone needs to watch her and flack toward her because she is exceptional as a founder.
Yes, it's her headquarters, right, is the name of her company. And she was just invited to the White House as an entrepreneur to sit on like the entrepreneurial, like Entrepreneurs of America was the title of the panel, pretty much. Yeah, don't quote me on that, but it was when I saw the picture, I was like, hot damn, good for you.
She's so good. I think David Thompson and John Gorman in the health tech space, what they're building with Mylan, and they've actually partnered up with Luis and Danny Lopez, who like generations ago built Crumb. Like there's just so many good companies and founders.
Yes. Okay, so for the next question is what news outlets, podcasts, or blogs are dedicated to covering startups in Omaha? And we have Silicon Prairie News headquartered out of Omaha. Yep. I'm going to kind of tailor the question because I know you write or you contribute to the Omaha World-Herald to discuss, I guess, the startup happenings at one of the biggest newspaper in the state. So how did that relationship come to be, and how has it been writing for the World-Herald on Omaha's startup scene?
On a personal level, I feel like I'm getting an MBA in like killer journalism from Randy Essex. So I owe him money probably for how much he's teaching me. It's incredible.
And he's
But
the
I
managing
also,
editor,
he's
right?
managing editor.
Yes.
I don't think anyone in the state really understood the caliber of editor that we got when we got Randy. So he, came from Detroit Free Press, which had incredible digital experience. The World-Herald's had a challenging year, but I think he's the right guy to do it and to innovate over there. And it came about, and I'm saying this completely joking, by the way, he like slid into my DMs on Twitter. So like, how often, like, hey, you have an interesting perspective on startups. I'd love to talk to you about what ongoing coverage might look like. And so that's a role I'm excited about. I mean, it's the first time in my career that my parents can actually see their dollars on a journalism degree put to use on anything, although I've completely forgotten all AP style. So again, sorry, Randy, I'll do better.
Yes. Yeah. So is your your directive by the World-Herald is to cover what's happening locally in the startup scene?
Yeah. I sort of take an angle. It's almost an intersection of the venture community at large, and then in our state, the startup and founder community and the industries that we're clustering around. You start to see Omaha cluster around financial services and health tech a little bit more, I think. And then startups and founders themselves. So like what is going on, who's doing what's exciting about them. And so it's been great, candidly, to take a step back and to look at the opportunities to tell the stories here, but also do it through a lens of, it's an op-ed piece, so it's not incredibly objective, but try to be a little bit more objective about how we position it.
Yes, yeah. And with, I guess, through that lens, what do you think are some of the biggest obstacles Omaha's facing as a community?
That's a good question. I think statewide we face a prototype capital crunch. Truthfully, I think when we blame the pipeline, we can look at where the funding starts here and where it needs to start to get some of these up and off the ground. So how do we bet bigger on programs like the DED prototype grant program, or how do we establish more sort of sidecar grant funds to go with that? I think that honestly is one of our biggest challenges. If you talk to our entrepreneurs, their fears are justified in starting up. Will there be customers for me? So how do we mitigate that risk? And will there be capital to support this? And if I can have confidence in those two things, then I can find concepts, I can build a company, but those two things really need to be mitigated to get someone to start.
Yes, yeah. So the Lincoln and Omaha business communities broadly, but I think it even goes down to the ecosystems, are thought of as very separately. And as someone who's balanced between both of them, I've always just, I guess, kind of thought that is interesting, that like my girlfriend lives in Lincoln and I can get to her place in 35 minutes from my house in Omaha.
Closer than two sides of Kansas City.
Exactly. Yes. And if we were living in like San Francisco, you could easily commute an hour to work, but driving from Omaha to Lincoln is just like blasphemous. Yeah.
We have the most convenient lives. That's why that's a problem.
Exactly. Do you think, is that is that an issue that people besides me have addressed, or will that continue? Will that be the status quo for as long as I live?
I feel like it's a perception versus a reality issue. So the perception is, and I think primarily amongst entrepreneur support organizations, that there isn't collaboration and there isn't camaraderie. I can't even say that word today, sorry. But if you talk to the founders, I don't think it's a thing, truthfully. I think, again, let's get back to our Nebraska roots. A founder in Kearney and a founder in Lincoln and a founder in Scottsbluff and a founder in Omaha probably are very pragmatic, very heads down, focused on getting customers, focused on building an excellent product. That DNA is shared regardless of where you are. You can be in Ainsworth, Nebraska and have that same ethos. I think the rest of us make it overly complicated and unnecessary. Like everyone's trying to claim victory when reality is Nebraska is doing great and we need to celebrate Nebraska.
Yes, yeah, and you bring up the western part of the state. How much?
It's like my favorite part of the state.
Yeah, so I'm from Sydney. I'm also a huge champion of Western Nebraska. How much entrepreneurial activity is going on in Scottsbluff, Chadron? I know you spent a bunch of time in the Sandhills this summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like the perception, especially like the Eastern Nebraska perception of Western Nebraska, is nothing's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's so silly, isn't it? Like, so let's look at Valentine, Nebraska. I'm enamored with Valentine, Nebraska for a lot of reasons. You know, I'm lucky we have a joint venture with the Bolo Beer Company. And I I kid you not, Valentine's fastest growing population is people in their 30s and people in their 50s. This is not a sleepy Sandhills town. This is a town where people are saying, oh my God, the big sky is gorgeous. I want to be outside. I want to be sort of in the thick of the Niobrara region. How do I do this? I mean, Valentine is booming and it is growing and its economy is doing better than it did prior to the pandemic. And I have had the pleasure, especially over the last year, of meeting, say, a dozen or so people in their 30s that chose to move there, not because mom and dad live there, not because they grew up there, but because it's a wonderful town and they can see themselves building a future there. So I think Ocala has a similar story. Truthfully, I think Kearney definitely has a story. North Platte has a story like that. Like, I think Sydney has that story. Hastings, like, I think it's naive for those of us in Omaha and Lincoln or even elsewhere to say it's sleepy. The reality is it's not. It's just not. It's just the same way as the rest of us Nebraskans. Nobody tells each other about it because we're so stinking humble. We don't tell these stories, so we don't really know.
Yes. Yeah. That's a very good point, Erica. All right. So one last question for you. So if I were to move to Omaha tomorrow and wanted to start a business, what should I do first?
Figure out what problem you're solving with that business is always my greatest advice. And I think that's the quickest way a founder can succeed and fail. And then I would say, come to the Startup Collaborative. Again, hyper biased there. But also, you know, we did this fun campaign, Nick. We did a confidence boosting campaign this year. And the theory was, if we can give you the confidence to start, you can take the bigger swings. So one of the things that we learned in that campaign, there were 400 plus people that participated, which is nutty to me. So 400 people across the state said, I actually want to start something. I want to think like a founder. I just need to like kind of get in the right mindset for it. The biggest takeaway was solve a big problem and know that you can survive a no. You can survive a no. That's not going to hurt you.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, very good advice, Erica. And thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely.
Now that we've learned about an ecosystem from a person who's building it, I'm going to link back up with Nick to clarify on some jargon and take a deeper dive into this ecosystem.
Hey Nick, how's it going? How was your interview?
Hello, Caitlin. So I absolutely loved talking with Erica. Since leaving, I bet even while I was in college, I've followed Erica on Twitter. So she's just kind of been like my regional thought leader that I've always just engaged with her stuff and have thought highly of her. That it was, and then I moved to Omaha now 8 months ago, and then connected her right when I moved. So we had a quick 30-minute get to know you, and spending the hour, almost an hour, it was about 30, 45 minutes of this interview, just talking with her about her career and her perspective of Omaha's community and building the Nebraska ecosystem was absolutely delightful. I really, really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it seems like you're kind of answering the question I was about to ask you already, but what was kind of some of your biggest takeaways from your interview?
Yes, yeah. So Erica contributes, Erica writes some for the Omaha World-Herald talking about Nebraska startup community. So asking her about how that happened and her perspective on using her voice to better the startup community, that was just, I guess, interesting. Another one, I've been a big, from my perspective, the business communities in Omaha and Lincoln, people in each of them think of the other as completely separate, and it's kind of been a big bugaboo for me that these two towns or cities that are 45 minutes from one another, that people don't really like work, or like there's not that much collaboration between the two. And I posed that problem to her, and she said that she didn't think it was as big of an issue, that when you actually start talking to entrepreneurs, no one is actually really saying that. It's more of like community leaders or people like on the outside looking in saying that, which it's always valuable to like talk to someone with a different opinion. And I enjoyed that she shared that opinion with me and was just very like just matter of fact about it. And then also, so I'm from the western part of the state. I went to the only public high school in my town, and I graduated with about 80 kids, 6,000 people lived in my town. And she talked a lot about the western part of Nebraska and community building in the more rural areas of Nebraska, which I don't think that many people put thought into or even appreciate that things are happening out there. So again, it was just good to hear her discuss that and shed some light onto it.
No, I find that, okay, so just an observation of that. You mentioned that the polarized view and getting to talk with her really cleared up some misconceptions that you really had. And I feel like that's really important just as a standard in today's society and basis. So I feel like the two of you having that conversation, learning more from that, I feel like we could definitely apply that more to the world if we wanted to progress a little bit.
Yes. Like as broadly as possible, it's important to like hear one another out. That there's just a lot of division in America right now, and even though like what Erica shared with me like was not the most polarizing topics to begin with, it was still good to have the discussion around it.
Yeah, certainly. So was there any jargon that you needed to look up, or was there any other topics that you wanted to be more educated on, anything you wanted to look up?
So Erica, with her background in communication and journalism, she didn't use many like, I guess, academic terms, which is we have this because like we have this section of like clearing up jargon, because a lot of our guests come from like the academic view of ecosystem building and can get just super jargony and then like lose us as the listener, other than after we have to give everything a quick Google. Erica doesn't really have that academic view, that she came from like the public relations world, so there was none. None came up for me.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So then I guess like kind of following up then after that was, do you have any last thoughts before we sign off?
It's from the entrepreneur's perspective, it's important to know your ecosystem builder. That afterwards, Eric and I exchanged some messages of just like, hey, we should definitely keep one another in the loop, and that will be very valuable moving forward. So knowing community leaders is important. And with that, Caitlin, do you want to read us out?
I sure do. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Ecosystem Builder Podcast, which is a product of Mug.News, hosted by Nick Kastner and Caitlin Clays. If you have any questions about today's episode, connect with us on Twitter at Nick Kastner, at Clays Creates, or at MugNews Official. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review and share with your friends. We release episodes every Wednesday morning, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a beat.
Tell your friends, seriously. See you next Wednesday.
Bye, guys.